Good evening. Welcome to the U.S. Embassy in Azerbaijan's Facebook page. We are delighted to have you join us this evening for the last of our April Earth Month series with the state of the natural environment very heavily including the state of the world's water resources, and that applies very much in Azerbaijan as well. We're delighted to have convened an expert panel this evening to discuss the state of water resources around the world and indeed here in Azerbaijan. Our panel this evening consists of Erika Weinthal, Professor of Environmental Policy and Public Policy at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Dr. Weinthal specializes in global environmental politics and environmental security with a particular emphasis on water and energy. Her research spans multiple geographic regions, including the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. Dr. Weinthal is the author of such works as State-Making and Environmental Cooperation, and she co-edited Water and Post-Conflict Peacebuilding, as well as the Oxford Handbook on Water Politics and Politics. Dr. Weinthal earned her PhD at Columbia University and her bachelor's degree at Oberlin College. Jeff DeBelko is a professor and associate dean at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University, a senior advisor to and former program director of the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Dr. DeBelko's current research focuses on environmental peacebuilding. He was a lead author of the Human Security chapter in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment and is a member of the UN Environment Programme's Expert Advisory Group on Environment, Conflict, and Peacebuilding. He co-edited with Environmental Peacemaking and Green Planet Blues, Critical Perspectives on Global Environmental Politics. Dr. DeBelko earned his PhD in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's in Political Science from Duke University. Joining them on the panel is Dr. Rovshan Abbasov, a former Fulbright visiting scholar and one of Azerbaijan's foremost water resources experts. For 20 years, Rovshan has worked on projects aimed at solving water problems and other problems related to natural and built ecosystems in Azerbaijan and the countries of the region. In 2020, UNDP published his report, Mainstreaming Climate Change-Related Activities into the Water Sector of Azerbaijan. Dr. Abbasov earned a PhD in geography from Baku State University and conducted his postdoctoral research at the University of California at Davis. Dr. Jaidev Jayasingh will be moderating this evening's discussion. Dr. Singh is a Foreign Service officer with the rank of counselor in his position as mission director for the United States Agency for International Development in Azerbaijan. He has served as USAID mission director to Azerbaijan since 2018, where his goal is to enhance the enduring partnership with Azerbaijan towards diversifying the economy, creating a transparent and open environment to maximize human capital and attract investment, and to advance the prosperity of the Azerbaijani people. Dr. Singh holds a doctorate from the University of Washington, Seattle, and master's degrees in business administration and international diplomacy. With that, I am delighted to welcome to the screen to make opening remarks, Dr. Rovshan Abbasov. Dr. Abbasov.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this nice meeting, and I'm very pleased to talk about my country's water-related concerns today, which is really big, and I want to share with you my presentation related to state of water use in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is a country where water shortage exists and exists every time. And this is a downstream country which quite a broad range of problems related to water, related to transponder water management issues caused by upstream countries. So Azerbaijan received a lot of water courses from upstream countries, from Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, and Iran. And unfortunately, mostly these water courses enters Azerbaijan with quite big problems, mostly pollution problems and excessive water withdrawals that exist in the territory of Armenia, Turkey, Georgia, and Iran. So Azerbaijan has just a few internal flow. So the water resources of Azerbaijan are mostly based on transponder water resources, which comprise nearly 70% of total water resources. We have just about 35% of local water resources that are used mainly for drinking purposes. And most water to Azerbaijan comes from abroad. So access to clean water is not so much high. Of course, it's much better than 1990s. It's improved, but still 30% of population of Azerbaijan have no access to clean water, which makes about more than 1 million of people, which is quite still big. So freshwater withdrawals, losses, and water use in Azerbaijan exist, and total freshwater withdrawals in Azerbaijan is about 40% of the total water resources, and it's getting increased because mostly agricultural is based on irrigation, and these water resources are used for irrigation of agricultural lands. And I should note here that over the last 15 years, area of the irrigated lands in Azerbaijan has doubled. So that's why we have big water losses. And the water losses exist mostly in irrigation, because irrigation is based on outdated methods and not advanced methods, which flood irrigation, which cause big water losses in my country. So you see use of water by sectors in this slide, and we see that agriculture, forestry, and fishing are the biggest water users. The second place takes electricity industry, which is mostly represented by hydropower production, and household use and manufacturing. So agriculture is a priority sector in Azerbaijan with respect to water management. So this is the statistics of the 2019, almost last year before the pandemic. So in this statistics confirms that agriculture is the biggest water user in Azerbaijan, and mining industry, and processing industry, and electroenergetics are the next water users. So water losses in urban water supply is big. In this figure, we see that water losses that depends on months. Mostly big water losses happen in winter months because in summer months we have shortage of water, and water sometimes is given by hours, not so. Many urban residents in Azerbaijan don't have 24/7 water use. Means that we have often and frequent interruptions in our water services in urban areas. And water losses happens because due to old distribution network. In Azerbaijan, we have legacy distribution networks from Soviet area, which is very hard to replace, because mostly it's in urban area, in Baku area, it's underground. It's very hard to detect water leakages that cause big water losses. So these pictures are taken from my universities. So it's a neighboring buildings. Everybody in Baku prefer to use its own water tank because of the interruptions in water services. And these water tanks cause additional expenses, and of course cause additional pollution of the drinking water. So in suburban areas, we have a lot of shanty towns, and these shanty towns mostly use their own distribution network, not planned, and it's very common. It's real to see water just flowing out from the distribution network, and it's really too hard to control this kind of water losses in suburban areas. So area, as I said, areas planted crops is getting increased, and related to 2000, it's almost double. So mostly Azerbaijan became again the biggest exporter of agricultural goods to Russia, and started to export agricultural goods to European countries. That's why economy Azerbaijan is directed to extend, to increase area of agricultural lands. So, but water losses in irrigation is caused due to outdated irrigation methods. Earth-based canals cause big water losses and lack of water-saving incentive in farmers, because water is really cheap, and our farmers are not much interested to save water because they got very nice subsidies, and the farmers who are close to the water sources use as much as they need, but downstream farmers always suffer from shortage of water. So climate change started to cause a reduction of water resources of Azerbaijan, and it's projected that water resources of Azerbaijan will be reduced due to increase of temperature and due to reduction of the precipitation in regions of Azerbaijan. And this map is made by our research team of the Khazar University, and it shows the projected climate changes where will mostly affect the area of Azerbaijan. As we see, the most of the area of Azerbaijan will be shaped by negative influence of the meteorological droughts. So droughts became very common over the last 10 years, and even over the last couple of years, the biggest river in the South Caucasus started to go dry, which is very unusual. And citizens of Azerbaijan, water users of Azerbaijan, never faced this kind of problem until 2018. So it's very big problematic issue. And because of the huge upstream water withdrawals, because of the huge interbasin water transfers from the basin of the Kura to other basins in the areas of upstream countries. For example, Turkey and Georgia started to build huge water reservoirs on the Kura River, which will cause a reduction of available water for downstream country, Azerbaijan. So this map shows flood hazards due to not proper interannual regulation of water. We also have big floods, which also says me that water scarcity is mostly economic water scarcity and can be better managed, of course. So soil degradation due to climate change became very common in mountain areas, and salination of the land in plain areas along the river Kura and Aras became very common. And climate change and environmental stress, the Khazar University research team has developed a special index which consider climate changes, water availability, land resources, and we see that environmental stress in many countries, in many districts of Azerbaijan is getting increased, and we really don't have any region in Azerbaijan which doesn't face this kind of problem. So, of course, this climate change caused shortage of irrigation and drinking water, and prolonged droughts create food shortages and may cause a reduction of food security in the future. So we have to develop a national strategy on climate changes. I'm very glad to say that Azerbaijan has started a new project. The Ministry of Environment of Ecology and Natural Resources of Azerbaijan, together with UNDP, has started a new project which take into account all climate change negative impacts, and they want to create national strategy, national adaptation strategy with respect to climate changes. And of course, climate change started to cause big water shortages, as already said, and it decreased income of farmers, and even in some places it started to cause migration for better income, And in high mountain areas, where people start to face soil degradation and climate change shaped water shortage, started to migrate to downhills to big cities. So this is all about my water-related, about the problems of my country, water-related problems of country. And if you have questions, I will be very glad to respond to your questions.
Thank you very much, Rovshan. I think we will take our questions at the end. We will bring all the panelists on to speak. So next up, we are very happy to introduce Dr. Jeff Debelko.
Terrific presentation, and thank you to the mission for this opportunity to talk. It is one where we'll pull the camera back, the lens back a bit from the country specific to a global take, and then Dr. Weinthal will come back to some specific regional and country cases. But in terms of understanding how these changing conditions around water are part of questions of cooperation and conflict. And so this, important to say, of course, where one comes from. These insights and what I've learned are really from colleagues and on the research and the policy side who've come together in this nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, where we have lots of opportunities for dialogue with AID and government and non-government and scientists and folks from all around the world. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So to literally take the lens back out to the globe, critical to understand that in this depiction, it shows that we have high water stress in many parts of the world, some of which is measured as extremely high. This is one of many ways to tell this story. This is a map from the Aqueduct Project at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., and it combines a couple of variables, both drought that we just heard about, as well as flooding, which I know is an issue that resonates as well, and kind of mixes those and creates a composite to understand where there are these real challenges around water stress. We can look at it through a different lens. This is literally projections for this calendar year done by the folks at iSciences, who are finding ways to mix and combine and analyze multiple data sets to get a picture of a more immediate sense rather than farther out to the distance that we see. Again, it's a globally occurring phenomenon in many instances, really high levels of challenge around water stress. Looking forward, same picture and even more red, suggesting more challenges for bigger swaths of the world, and particularly, of course, the region that we're talking about here today. And so if that's the kind of context in which we find differentiated stresses, but really stress all over the world, we kind of ask ourselves, well, what are our political institutions to take this on, and how big a problem, particularly if we go up to questions of between countries, where water is shared between countries. And 310, remarkably, is the number of rivers that are shared by 2 or more countries. So not only is the stress widely distributed, so is the interdependence. So is the interdependence on this resource that flows sometimes as a border, sometimes from one to the other. As we know, lots of diverse cases. So we're a very intertwined political map, as well as a water stress map that is kind of a critical baseline to understand. And I should say these are numbers that do change. When I started talking about these issues some decades back, it was more like 280, and in part because we have better understanding and more granularity, that we know that there are even more cases than we thought there were. Here's again from the folks who are producing a lot of this work, Aaron Wolf and his colleagues at Oregon State University, give a sense of where those transboundary basins are, international basins around the world. So again, distributed in many respects in all parts of the world. And so the the kind of default or intuitive way that those two things are put together, water stress and high levels of interdependence and connectivity between countries around water, is often, and it's not a mistake that I'm using newspaper headlines here to illustrate that notion that this begets conflict, begets war and water wars. And it's a very common frame, particularly a fan by headline writers and sometimes by politicians, but kind of characterizing this level of interdependence, increased scarcity, therefore we'll see this conflict. And in some cases, highly or maybe over-represent. And so we hear a lot about it with 3 quotes from leaders from Egypt. And the Nile is a basin that gets a lot of attention. It's very familiar, it's critically important, lots of countries, lots of people dependent on that resource for their livelihoods. And so this is where we see so often the notion that this will be a source of conflict. But it turns out that as a way to introduce the notion that sometimes cooperation can be pursued to pull the political boundaries off, to talk about different ways we can use water and do it. And so very senior level, often facilitated, the Nile Basin Initiative being one. And at the same time, we know, because we're seeing in the headlines tonight too, that that can still be highly disruptive, particularly with big infrastructure that can dramatically change, quite literally turning the spigot off, the dynamics about sharing water downstream. So this is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which of course is a great concern to downstream, particularly Sudan and Egypt. But one case obviously gets a lot of attention in this space, but that's not really how we can truly study it. This again, Aaron Wolf and his colleagues, although we can say lots of great graduate students who did this, like so many professors, there's a great team of graduate students behind him or her, that characterized all interactions between 2 or more states and coded them from most cooperative to most conflictual. And I think there are a number of things that one can take out of these data. But one is that there is that verbal hostility. There's a lot of concern and a lot of verbal threats being made, political statements and such. Not so much when it gets down to the formal engaged hostilities over water. And at the same time, there's a lot of blue up there too, in terms of a lot of cooperation. It takes some work, and there's basin arrangements and commissions and such take work and take investment, often are underinvested in, but have real prospects for coordinating and sharing benefits, and a means to have conversations, even when in times of tension or uncertain relations between countries. This is probably a little difficult to parse out and don't want to go into great detail, but essentially a lot of the conflict, even when it's verbal, is about quantity, but the diversity of ways that countries are cooperating is much more diverse, many more opportunities for doing that, for quality, for quantity, for hydropower, for irrigation, for economic development, joint management, infrastructure and such. And so it was a suggestion that there are multiple ways to find ways to talk and cooperate, even perhaps when other things are not proceeding in ways that are necessarily seen as cooperative. We do have some legal mechanisms to draw upon that do not have all countries as signatories, but whether it's the 97 Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses or the UNECE Water Convention, there are what are soft international law that are becoming norms that are more widely adopted in terms of prior notification of infrastructure that will have potentially adverse downstream effects, an obligation not to create significant harm. And of course, how one defines that is the kind of when it really comes to the challenging parts. But nevertheless, we're seeing norms developing in ways that we recognize this interdependence and have mechanisms for finding ways to work together. I should say, even in the areas where we have still high levels of conflict and contestation, high level disagreement, we're seeing evidence that particularly when we bring it down below the level of the national government's interaction and the formal, that there are real opportunities for taking, in some ways, advantage of those geographies and those dependents. Sometimes it's about the quantity of water. Often in the case here in the Middle East, it's the quality of the water, that coming together in some ways, and these kind of little dots represent communities on either side of a border that are mutually dependent on those water sources, the quantity and the quality of them, and finding ways from the bottom up to have ways to manage, establish connections, and build trust, cooperation, with the hope of course, being able to contribute to more cooperation and, ultimately and ambitiously more peace. These aren't in any way to suggest that these efforts will solve all the problems or the larger problems or even what's at stake. But in some ways, the water management can be a lifeline for dialogue in times of conflict and tension. As the professor said in his presentation, climate change is a huge wild card and is driving a lot of the change that makes some of us pause and really ask the question: will the future look like the past? Right? If we study the past, try to predict the future, climate change is making that more difficult because it is changing so rapidly. And so for a variety of reasons that were laid out in the last presentation, as well as some listed here, it's really critical that we take that into account and build it into all our assessments of how we manage water, the different ways that we use it, and how we cooperate inside and across national boundaries. And so I thank you for the opportunity and look forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And our last speaker this evening is Dr. Erika Weinthal. Dr. Weinthal.
Great. Okay. Okay. I hope the slides will move.
It is. It's right there. It's
okay.
perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Just okay. I also want to thank Richard and Jay, the U.S. Embassy in Baku, for allowing me to share the platform with my colleagues, Professor Abbasov and Professor Debelko, on topic of water during Earth Month. And I am going to bring in, hopefully, the angle more of how water can be a leverage, a tool for peace building. Once you understand many of the issues that make water a source of conflict, how do we turn it into a source for building peace? And the question is, how do I move the slides? This is where I'm stuck.
Just the down arrow on your computer, your keyboard should do the job.
It is not working. I'm gonna try. Let's see. No, it's not letting me move
this space bar, maybe.
Nope. Technical difficulties. Should can I stop? Can someone
Indeed.
else move my...
Let me investigate. 1 second. I should be right back.
Or I can share my screen again and do it myself.
Sure. Why don't we try that?
Okay. Apologies. Okay. Is that working?
It seems to be. We have a new slide anyway.
Okay, so let me go back to where I was. Can you see the full screen if I'm on the screen like this?
We do. It's a scarce.
Okay. So then let's see if this works. Let me just, it's not letting me move my slides again.
If, down below, I see actually there's an icon beneath, perhaps arrowing onto the arrows. Actually, we'll move them left and right.
No. So if I'm going to go out and not see the screen, but I won't be able to see anyone. Is that okay?
That's okay. We can see you.
Okay, I have to do this again. Okay, so I'm just going to keep talking and hope this works. So what I want to start with, just going back to where Professor DeBelko was talking about water basins and the importance of rivers and transparent and shared water systems. Often water is shared between states. It's also often why we think about it is because it's frequently a scarce resource. And why water is a concern for so many of us globally is that there is incredible variability, both temporally and geographically. So some parts of the world have very limited water resources and some have abundant water resources. And you may see high levels of rainfall at different times, such as the monsoons in South Asia. But what makes water so important is that it is necessary for human health and livelihoods. Unlike energy, oil resources, which Azerbaijan is so rich in, there is no substitute for water. It also is of cultural significance for many, as this is a picture of the Jordan River, which is of significance for many people worldwide. Why we like to talk about shared water as a tool for peace building is that water transcends political borders. It is shared among countries. So the Indus is one basin, but also the Kura-Arak basin within the Caucasus is another example of a shared hydrological basin. And because of this interdependence, in many ways, it demands cooperation to prevent pollution, overutilization, as you heard from Professor Abbasov today. And it's moreover important for economic growth or recovery for countries that may be emerging from conflict. I'm going to use some examples from my prior work to highlight how water has been leveraged in other parts of the former Soviet Union as a source of cooperation, but it's also been a source of conflict at times. And this comes from Central Asia and the Aral Sea Basin, where water has both been a source of tension, but has also provided some entry points for preventative diplomacy, for dialogue, for peacemaking, and as a form of regional cooperation. One of the dynamics in the former Soviet Union, when it broke up, it took what was once an internal water basin, and so this is something that is also relevant for the Caucasus, and turned it into an international river basin as you had the creation of new political borders, these changing institutional contexts, which often creates possibilities for increased tension as new states have newly defined interests about how to use their water resources. And so the Aral Sea Basin is shared among 5 states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. It's comprised of 2 separate basins, the Syr-Darya and the Amudarya. Central Asia, what caught the attention of the international community was the shrinking of the Aral Sea, which was a result of policies during the Soviet Union to allocate water for the growing of cotton, particularly cotton monoculture. And so over a short period from the 1960s to the 1990s, the sea essentially desiccated, where sea level fell by about 15 meters, the surface level shrunk by half, and salinity increased, and the fishing industry really disappeared. And so you had these images of ships in the sand. To try to understand changing institutional structure, when one looks at a water basin, one really needs to disaggregate and think about these asymmetries of interest and capabilities. And so what we saw in Central Asia was this tension between wanting to use water for hydropower versus agriculture, and this increasing tension between the needs of the upstream states versus the midstream or downstream countries. And in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the creation of new states, you saw upstream states wanting to use their water resources for hydropower. So Tajikistan wanted to build a dam, the new dam, the Rogan. Kyrgyzstan was using the Toktagul reservoir for hydropower. But the downstream states wanted to have the water be used for agriculture. And so this tension was created about whether, to charge for exports of gas and oil to the upstream states. And there was a need for new institutions, essentially, to manage changing interests and changing power asymmetries. And so some of the lessons we've learned from looking at the Aral Sea Basin was the importance of, how to approach building new institutions for managing a shared water basin. Do you look at it as the entirety of the Aral Sea Basin, or as has transpired over time, do you break up the negotiations into smaller basins? So do you look at the Sir-Darya Basin and the Amu Darya Basin? How do you think about issue linkage? Is it about managing water, or is it about managing water, energy, and agriculture, since agriculture is the largest use of water in most parts of the world? Why is cooperation even more necessary is that much of this water also, some of it originates in Afghanistan, but often too, this is fed by glaciers that are affected by climate change. So climate change is adding a whole other variable into how we understand managing water. Just to provide some additional examples of this work on water and peace building, I helped edit a volume on water and post-conflict peace building, which there is a chapter in the volume on the Kura Arax River Basin too. And it was looking at how water can be leveraged for building peace, facilitating development, but also the role that donors can play in technical cooperation. And some of the lessons that we found from looking at a whole array of cases is that of 55 countries that were affected by major conflict during or since 1990, 51 of them have had at least one basin that is shared with others. So shared water is really, can provide an entry point for states coming out of conflict. We had 19 case studies, again, including the Kura Arax Basin. We had researchers from all over the globe that were working on trying to tease out lessons. And what we, some of the lessons that we found, when facing political tension, leveraging water can help build capacity. It can be leveraged for technical cooperation. So using water as a means to build cooperation at a technical level, even where political cooperation may be difficult, because it provides a platform for improving dialogue amongst, states, civil society, scientists. It can, USAID has been involved in many of these efforts, both in the Caucasus, but also in the Middle East, and bringing scientists together to essentially address issues of water quality degradation, the role of agriculture, looking at urban pollution. Cases where water has served as an entry point was after the dissolution of Yugoslavia. One of the first ways that actors came together was to conclude a treaty for managing the Sava River Basin. So here too, water served as a mechanism for dialogue, building confidence, capitalizing on shared interests in the Balkans. Jeff Debelko talked about the Middle East, where Israel and Jordan water managers would come together, for decades before peace was established, to talk about the management of the water in what was called the picnic table talks. And this, in many ways, facilitated the Israel-Jordan peace treaty by having scientists who actually spoke the same technical language and knew each other. And so that fed into having a section of the Israel-Jordan peace treaty that was devoted entirely to water. Just to conclude too with the example that it's not just having technical cooperation at the level of scientists, but really thinking about how water can bring communities together to talk about their shared interests. In the Middle East, this is about the restoration of the Lower Jordan, the restoring of the Dead Sea through the Good Waters Neighbors Project led by EcoPeace. And so to conclude, one of the areas that permeate all aspects of water management is governance. So having good governance from the local all the way scaling up to the national, the regional, ensuring access to water is important for meeting basic human needs. It plays a role in restoring livelihoods, food security, economic growth. But most importantly, it can serve as a tool for reconciliation, restoring trust and confidence. And then we have to, today, we really need to think about the threats, what climate change impacts, from having droughts, as Dr. Abbasov mentioned, and also floods that can threaten any of the peace dividends that can be achieved by leveraging water. So with that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you to all of you, to Roshanbe, to Jeff, and to Erica for your really interesting presentations. I've got a few questions that have been coming through fast and furious from our audience. But just to start off, I want to thank you all for doing this. This is important. As you all know, Azerbaijan has regained territories that had been occupied, and now they have actually additional water resources, which is also an important asset that they have now. So I think so. I just want to say congratulations to the people of Azerbaijan in that regard, and to the gaining more resources. This is critical given, as Roshanbe's his presentation presented, there is a danger of climate change. There is an issue of water shortages in the country. But I think what we're looking at is there's a potential for using technology and latest science to also look at water from a technical issue, but also as a way to look at this as a common pool of resources to getting people together at the table, talk about regional cooperation and stability and peace. So I think Azerbaijan is in a good place in that regard. And I'd like to open up the floor. And I think let me just start off with some questions that we've gotten so far. Largely, this is from Andreas, who says, "Does Azerbaijan only have does Azerbaijan take water only from rivers and not from water wells or deep water reserves?"
So surface water is the biggest contribution of the water supply because, of course, we have water wells and groundwater resources in Azerbaijan, but they are not big, and groundwater use require more advanced methods, more sustainable approaches. That's why I always support use of surface water resources in a more sustainable way. And of course, groundwater helps us to solve these issues, several issues in a short time. And groundwater cannot be a guarantee of the best water management in a long time. I think Azerbaijan should try to find ways to cooperate with upstream countries and to use its own surface water more properly.
I don't know if Erica or Jeff, did you have any other observations?
I would just say part of the groundwater is critically important. It is more challenging on that international institutional cooperation that I talked about, where the surface water that's visible and easier to count and you have at least some sense of where it is, doesn't hold so much for groundwater. So critically important, also a shared resource, but one that's a little harder to jointly manage in the same way that surface water does.
The only thing I'll add is with groundwater, there aren't as many legal tools at the international level that are available for sharing groundwater. And then the quality of groundwater is a huge consideration that needs to be taken into account, largely because there are so many naturally occurring contaminants that need to be tested for.
Yeah, and I think that's critical. Given climate change and the changing temperatures, the preservation of groundwater becomes much more difficult. So I think that's something that Etibar Net in his question is: are there approaches or technical approaches that we can use to avoid wastage of drinking water, especially? And I know there's been some talk about using reverse osmosis to use the Caspian Sea, but I'm not sure if that's a viable option here. So I'll start with Roshan.
Yes, as I already mentioned, as I already mentioned, that Azerbaijan started the adaptation project, climate change adaptation project, and Azerbaijan considered to use in the future unconventional water sources such as Caspian Sea, and there are big opportunities to desalinate. The issue is in that it's still expensive and
I think we lost you for a second.
Yeah, expensive, and I would also just carry on in one line for the professor. Kind of also it's very energy intensive, so it can continue to exacerbate that problem what we talked about on climate change by depending on how that energy is produced. If it's the use of fossil fuels, then it kind of continues to add to the problem that you're trying to solve with the technology. So it's a challenge.
I mean, one thing too with desal is you can use brackish water, you can use different sources of water for desalinating, so that it can, be less expensive, and at least in the Middle East, the price for desalination has been decreasing.
I think the second question that Etibar asked was, what about the impurities in rainwater that feeds these groundwater resources? I mean, that's also an issue too, with a lot of pollution in some places that does have an impact on groundwater. I mean, that's also I haven't seen a lot of discussion on that, but I think it's a good question to ask about the impurities and pollution of groundwater from the rainwater. I'll leave it to anybody who can answer that. I mean, I think the issue is, yes, there is issues, but I think a good purification system would resolve some of those issues. Let me just also, Amin Mammadov has posted some interesting observations about the role of the interesting piping that is used from water resources up country to places like Baku along the coast to provide fresh water from the underground resources. So I think the question he's trying to ask, I think in my mind, is that sustainable in the long run? I'm not sure it is, but given the fact that a lot of the water, especially now that the line of contact is no longer an issue, can that also be an asset for water resources in Baku? That's a question I'm also very interested in asking that.
So what I want to add to this question, unfortunately, this is not sustainable because pumping groundwater so much will cause problems in rural areas where water comes from. Amin Mammadov mentions Oghuz Gabala pipeline. Now, as I know, the water company looks for another sources of water to fill that pipeline, not from groundwater sources, because it's becoming fewer and more and more water withdrawn, and groundwater levels in that area is getting dropped. So we cannot rely on groundwater in a long-term perspective in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, I've noticed from some of my projects that we've done in the region, the old Soviet piping has also fallen apart. And so one of the things we're doing is we're providing PVC piping so that there's a lot less of water leakage that goes into the soil through these bad pipes. But I think there has to be some investment also in the infrastructure of water distribution. I'm not sure if has been any studies on that issue at all.
Yeah, there are several studies in urban areas regarding groundwater leakages because all Soviet distribution systems really not properly working, and it caused big water losses in urban areas, and it's really hard to change them directly in streets because there's no much technology to detect this kind of leakages, and it's really too hard to replace old system. The another important issue is that most of irrigation canals in Azerbaijan are the earth canals, which cause big water leakages as well. And now in some places government and irrigation companies started to build concrete canals or pipelines to prevent that water losses. So water loss is a big issue for Azerbaijan. About 40% of water withdrawn from the sources is just lost.
Wow.
Can I ask, Roshan, I saw on one of your slides what looked like drip irrigation. And, you know, that's a way to prevent overuse and leakage in the agricultural sector.
Yes.
To what extent is that being introduced?
Yes, I know that, for example, I wanted to give one example, FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization project that goes on right now. It tries to change this kind of water irrigation methods, and they started to build, to make pilot areas where they apply drip irrigation. Of course, drip irrigation in Azerbaijan has very big future, and it will depend how I think involving private sector, the water sector in Azerbaijan is very important. If companies will introduce drip irrigation technology to Azerbaijan, that will work. But another problem is that our farmers are very poor and they cannot obtain this kind of technologies. They need support from government or from international organizations. So drip irrigation, water salinization, and drop irrigation also has big future in Azerbaijan.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Janine Mitchell. I think goes to Jeff and Erica. There's a debate in the recent environmental peacekeeping literature on whether a focus on technical cooperation for peace, such as water resource management, ultimately produces the kind of community-level cooperation that Dr. Weinthal mentions as being so important. So in light of the the recent war and everything, what are your observations on that? I mean, there's still a pretty tense environment here. There's an issue of scale. At what scale do we have discussions, and the impacts, and how is that managed at different levels? But I think that's a good question to ask. What has been your experience in that regard?
So this is the area that gives me optimism still in many parts of the world. You know, I've spent a considerable amount of time looking at this in the Middle East. And, you know, in the absence of bringing people together, the political conflict basically severs any form of interaction. And scientists, you know, and communities, you know, NGOs that work at the local level, they have a language that allows them to meet and to maintain dialogue, but it also scales up where, you know, India and Pakistan have fought numerous wars, but they have always kept talking over water. Same with, you know, Jordan and Israel. Despite, you know, political tensions, when it comes to water, they all have the same vested interest. And so this is, you know, it's an area where one could be cynical, but it is in many ways, you know, that last resort that keeps people at the table.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, in kind of endorsing and building on what Dr. Weinthal said, I would say there is that technical that is the scientific and that common language. I think there's also a common language that communities and people, whether they are trained scientists or not, understand. And so some of those pairings of communities for that local work is that, kids on both sides of borders get sick with dirty water. And so that shared interest around addressing sanitations and water quality issues can be, particularly if one works with community members and often young people who can then work through schools and then pair schools and then aggregate up, but also bringing in the technical. But in some ways, the technical is a kind of a straightforward WASH initiative around washing hands and what that means in terms of health and such. So it can be scientific and technical, but shared also in terms of ways that interdependence becomes clear and that is an opportunity for interaction at the community level as well as the scientist to scientist.
I just have to add one more thing. It's also in the volume on water and post-conflict peace building. It's also where women play a really important role, because women have a different understanding in many situations about the importance of having clean water and access to clean water, and the importance it plays for girls' education in some cases, or access to the workplace.
Thanks. I think let me ask you, Roshan Bey, your observation given the current situation. Also, when after Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of these, as I think you and Jeff and Erica mentioned, these shared basins that were under one country have now become international basins versus a common basin. As we know, in the current context of Azerbaijan, that has also been the case. But what is your observations and what are your thoughts on looking at asking this question about community level engagement to high level engagement?
So I think Azerbaijan side, after all this happened and the occupied lands are liberated, Azerbaijan side is highly motivated in cooperation with neighboring countries. And I feel that water-related issues in South Caucasus can be a tool for future peace buildings. So because all the transponder waters that come from upstream countries polluted to Azerbaijan, but there's no winners. Everybody loses, everybody. And I think water can become a common interest of all countries, and we can cooperate with our neighboring countries at scientific level, at community level, at government level. I believe that all sides will understand that it's time to cooperate. It's time to start new cooperation, not only in water-related issues, but only in transportation issues. So this kind of conflicts cannot be lasted forever.
Yeah, and I think you raise a very important point. President Aliyev has been very clear that he wants to build a regional cooperation along a number of issues, to have a sort of common goal for common prosperity, shared resources, management, transportation. So in that regard, I think it's very commendable that he has that vision, and I hope that he succeeds in that. So I think it's a very good vision. And I think you're right. I think it's going to take some time to build the trust, but as long as Azerbaijan adheres to that vision and keeps that vision, and President Aliyev keeps pushing it, I think that there's a lot of hope. There's another question from Becky Pulju, who basically wants to know what role does crop choice play in Azerbaijan's water resource picture? Would dedicating resources to cultivating different crops make sense?
So I wanted to talk just about virtual water, but there was not enough time. I think Azerbaijan should be prepared to water resilient agriculture. So we don't need to plant crops that require a lot of water. So that's why I would call it climate change shaped agriculture, or dryland agriculture, or water resistant agriculture. Has big future in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan should choose what crops can be planted here in the future, and what type of crops are water resistant. So it has water savings, adaptation has big future in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, and I just want to put a plug, for U.S. Embassy and USAID. We've been working with the government of Israel also on using technology for water for better water resource plants and agriculture. We actually have a demonstration plot in Ganja with the Agricultural State University, and also a connection with the Oklahoma State University's College of Agriculture. It's very exciting because we're looking at growing crops with using less water and actually much more efficient growing of crops, better fertilizers, more natural, and that's helping quite a bit. For every dollar we invested in some of these crops from USA perspective, the Azerbaijani farmers have been able to raise or actually earn over $7 per kilo, and that's incredible. And I think that just shows that the fertility of the soil here is high. If water management is done properly, the agriculture industry in Azerbaijan could be the next oil for Azerbaijan. So I think we're actually pretty optimistic about that. But again, I think the issue that we'd like to see is this cooperation that can happen, so that as President Aliyev has very clearly mentioned, that they want to have a regional cooperation. I think that's in the interest of everybody. So I think I don't want to take too much more time. We're past the 1 hour mark. And I just wanted to ask if our participants wanted to give a 1 minute closing remarks before we formally close the event. So we'll start with Roshan Bey, and then go to Jeff and Erica.
So I want just thank Embassy of United States in America for giving attention to this kind of issues, because the water is a problem number one for Azerbaijan and for our neighboring countries. I think that the people are highly motivated to listen to us, and that the questions were very interesting. And I just propose to continue this kind of efforts in the future. And I believe this kind of discussions always make us winners.
Great.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment of thanks for facilitating this conversation. I think it's terrific to have the specificity and the deep knowledge of Azerbaijan in the place, and also to kind of look to and engage with cases and experiences outside the region to learn from those lessons, whether they be ones that you want to emulate or ones you want to avoid. And so appreciate the opportunity for engagement.
And likewise, I'm delighted to be participating in this event. I was in Baku several decades ago, and I remember having conversations about the great potential that there was in the agricultural sector. And so it's wonderful to hear the work that USAID is doing in helping to develop, the agricultural sector, but also linking it to, more efficient water use. So this has been a real pleasure to be part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Eric. And I also just want to highlight a comment you mentioned about the role of women. And that's something that we are looking very carefully at, and we will engage with you on how we can do that more effectively. So I appreciate that comment. Let me turn it back to Richard. And I just want to say on behalf of the Embassy and USAID, this has been a great discussion. And we hope to do more of this, and hope to cooperate more with Azerbaijan and to support their plans for prosperity and diversifying the economy. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Jay, and thanks so much, Roshan, Erica, and Jeff. It's been a really excellent discussion, and thanks to everyone who joined us this evening. Regarding the last question, which Jay talked a little bit about some of the work USAID is doing here in Azerbaijan's agriculture sector to make it more climate resilient, water efficient, and yield better results for farmers. I invite you to look further down on the Embassy Facebook page to see an event that was held recently with the USAID mission and some of the experts here. It's got lots of interesting information on some of the great work that's happening here that I'm sure you'd find interesting. But that's it for this evening, and indeed that's it for Earth Month. Thanks to everyone who joined us all month long, and please join us in May when we do some programming around the theme of entrepreneurship. So for now, thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.